And thank you all for being here. I'm super excited to have this time to talk a little bit about some of my work on designing for intentional technology use. So technology, of course, can mean a lot of things, as you all know. For the purposes of this talk, we'll be talking about the kind of user-facing, screen-based experiences with mass penetration that you're all very familiar with, like mobile phones, tablets, computers, television, and all of the content that goes along with them. So these technologies provide us with tremendous value, as I'm sure you've noticed. You can video chat with your friend on the other side of the world. You can use a tablet as a synthetic voice if you lack the ability to speak. Increasingly, Twitter has become an essential mechanism for distributing information as part of relief efforts in response to natural and man-made disasters. In addition to all of this value, we also spend a lot of time with technology. So the average American spends a little more than 10.5 hours a day with screen-based experiences and checks their smartphone about 150 times, or about once every 6 minutes that you're awake. This isn't just a phenomenon that applies to adults. Today, American children spend more time with screen-based technology than they do in school. And this is true kind of across socioeconomic strata. So in low-income communities in the US, for example, about 75% of preschoolers own their own dedicated mobile device before they turn 4. This is also true around the world. So people in places like Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and Poland, and South Africa, for example, all share more content online than we do here in the United States. So we're quite engaged with these technologies. We spend a lot of time with them, but these aren't always empowering experiences. So there is, people often report symptoms of what's known as problematic internet use. This is a pattern of engaging with internet-connected experiences in a way that leads to distress or functional impairment of daily life. This isn't just a first world problem, and in fact, as national quality of life in a country goes down, the incidence of problematic internet use goes up. So for example, a pretty recent study on college students in Bangladesh found that about 25% display symptoms of PIU. People say that they feel the need to check in with technology even when they know that it's going to make them feel lousy, when they think it's going to compromise their productivity, or even put their physical safety at risk. So at this very moment, there are 660,000 people driving on a road in the United States while looking at a phone. So given all of the value that technology adds, all of the time that we spend with it, and some of these patterns of disempowerment and dysfunctional use, today managing the way we engage with technology has become an essential part of daily life. And the last thing I want to say about this before I talk about some of my work is that this is not an accident. This is very much a designed phenomenon. So user engagement is a primary goal and metric for lots of tech companies. This is sometimes referred to as the attention economy or the eyeballs economy, which just means that your attention is valuable and generates revenue for someone, potentially through metrics like click-through rates or ad impressions or time spent with a particular experience. Now, companies have lots of different ways of attracting and holding your attention. Sometimes they do so by providing you with an experience that has value for you. And sometimes they do so by exploiting classic psychological principles that they know about you, like your need to belong or your responsiveness to variable rewards. So the goal of the studies that I'm going to be talking about today are all around this theme of how can we support users in engaging with technology only on their own terms and in ways that they feel good about. So I'm going to talk about 3 different projects. The first is an exploration of the kinds of limits and boundaries that people want on their technology use, and then 2 different design projects, one targeting adults and one targeting kids. So this first project on family technology rules. So it was a project we called Not at the Dinner Table, which looked at how kids and parents set boundaries on technology use at home and what they want for their family. So we chose to look at the rules that families set because rules offer this glimpse into intentions and desired behaviors. So it tells you a little bit about what behaviors people think are appropriate, what they want to do. And it also tells you a little bit about what behaviors are challenging, what's hard to stick with. So parents don't say to their kids like, look, you're not allowed to use your phone to steal someone's identity, because that's not a hard challenge for them. So it gives us a little bit of insight into what the sticky points are. So we asked 2 questions in this project. First, what rules and expectations do children and their parents have for each other about technology use? And then what makes these rules and expectations easier or harder to live up to? This was a survey study. We recruited 249 parent-child pairs from around the country, and these were kids between the ages of 10 and 17. And for each family, we first asked, of course, the parents what rules they had for their child's use of technology. And this has historically been kind of the sum total focus of research in this space. But we also kind of wanted to take a more family-centric view where we looked at how this was playing out for people of all ages. So we asked the kids, what rules and expectations do you have for your parents' use of technology? We also asked parents what sorts of behaviors they thought were appropriate for themselves. And we asked kids what sorts of rules they were expected to live up to. And then we took all of these descriptions, these open-ended descriptions of the rules and expectations that they had, and we used content analysis to cluster them into different types of rules and compare the properties of some of those different rules. So these are the rules that we saw for kids, and they clustered into a taxonomy of 12 different categories. The area of each of these dots represents how frequently that particular type of rule came up for the people in our study. The most common types of rules were what we called be present rules. These were rules about being respectful and responsive toward the people who you're physically spending time with. So things like be present during events and functions and mealtimes. Second most common types of rules were rules about privacy. It's like I can't give my phone number to strangers. And then we saw a number of different types of rules, things like content restrictions, no grand theft auto. So rules about what kids can and can't do with technology. Parent audits. This is when kids would have to give their social media passwords to their parents or give them access to all their text messages so that parents could check up on what kids have been doing. And we saw that these categories clustered into 2 overarching umbrellas that we called activity constraints and context constraints. And these came up roughly equivalently, so about the same number of rules in each of these categories. So activity constraints are rules about what kids can do with technology, things like no Snapchat. And these are kind of all or nothing rules that either say something is okay or it isn't. Second types of rules, context constraints, were things like no phones at the dinner table, which didn't ban anything outright, but sort of set contextual boundaries on when things were and weren't okay. And this difference is interesting because we saw that context constraints were much harder than activity constraints. So essentially, easier to just ban something altogether than it is to set kind of nuanced boundaries on when it is and isn't okay to engage with. So kids said they were less likely to follow these types of rules. Parents said that they were harder to enforce, and kids told us that they required more effort. So even to get to that lower level of compliance took more work. I mentioned the rules that we saw for parents briefly. Again, these rules clustered into a taxonomy of common themes. And again, the most common type of expectation that parents and kids alike had for adults in their family was be present. So kids said stuff like, pay attention, put down the phone when your child is trying to tell you something important. So the findings that came out of this that I specifically want to build on today, first was the importance of presence as a kind of family value. So across the spectrum, across the US, this was the most frequently cited rule for family members of all ages. The second is this new problem of context. So historically, rules around technology use have been all about what we call activity constraints here. So all about what kids can do with technology. But today, about half of the rules that families are setting are about what is okay and when, and more context-specific boundaries. And then finally, the piece that I want to build on next is this idea that saying no is easier than saying, well, sometimes. And that's interesting because we want people to be able to get the value that they're seeking out of technology. We don't want them to have to throw it out altogether. And so how can we support people in engaging with experiences that they value without bringing along all of these side effects that they don't feel so great about? So no is easier than sometimes. So the second project kind of built directly on that challenge. This was a project that we called MyTime to explore how smartphones might help adults in engaging in this kind of targeted non-use that they're interested in. So help them continue using their phones in the ways that they value and maybe cut back on some aspects of phone use that they don't like so much. Specifically, we were asking, can smartphones support users in engaging only when they feel good about doing so? And to start, we recruited a panel of expert designers to come up with as many possible design solutions as they could. These were pretty wide-ranging, but we clustered them using affinity diagramming, and they fell into a taxonomy of 8 different styles of intervention. So these same types of approaches came up again and again. So these were things like providing users with information, so just kind of passively surfacing information about their usage behaviors, giving them rewards for engaging in specific types of behaviors, setting up barriers that made it harder to engage in behaviors they don't feel good about, and so forth. Then for each one of these categories, we created wireframes and storyboards with what we called category exemplars, where we tried to really get at the essence of that category. So for example, for this information category, we had this wireframe with a widget that kind of passively presented information about how much time someone spent with experiences that they want to cut back on. So this says you've been on Facebook for 28 minutes today, something like that. For the punishment category, we came up with this design. I mean, you have to come up with some bad ideas in order to get to the good ones, I think. So we came up with this design where you would choose a picture of something you don't want to see, like a spider or a photo of your ex, and then as you engage in this pattern of behavior that you want to change, this image starts to appear more and more frequently on screen. Okay, I don't know. Then we conducted a survey with a few hundred people where we showed them all of these different scenarios, and we asked them how interested they would be in trying some of these out. There were a few that they liked and said they'd like to give a try, specifically the information, limit, and mindfulness categories. There were a few that they were kind of neutral about and weren't sure if they would try. These were our reward and appeal to values categories. And then there were a few that they hated, and they said there was no way they were going for the spiders. So we threw out all of these, and we created a compound intervention that combined all 3 of these approaches. The result was an app we called MyTime, which lets the user select some experiences that they want to monitor, set goals about the amount of time they're going to spend with those experiences, and combines all 3 of these different categories. So it included this aspiration setting window that shows up each day where you can optionally choose to say what some of your goals are for the day. So as part of our mindfulness approach, as part of our information approach, we had this persistent notification in the notification shade. So anytime you're engaging with a monitored app, you can see how you've been spending your time. And then as part of our limit setting approach, whenever a user bumped up against one of those boundaries that they'd set for themselves in their initial tracking setup, this dialog would pop up and tell them that they had run out of time. Recruited 23 Android users to participate in a deployment study. We had them first fill out this survey where they told us about their current behaviors, things that they feel good about doing with their phones, things that they'd like to change. And then we collected a week of baseline data where we just passively logged everything that they did with their phone without any kind of intervention to see what they were doing. And then we did a 1-week intervention deployment where they used the MyTime app. So we saw that our participants chose to monitor 139 different apps. We took each of the apps that they tracked and for that person compared those apps against their initial survey responses to see whether the things that they said they felt good about using and the things they wanted to cut back on aligned with what they chose to monitor. And unsurprisingly, most people chose to track something that they had explicitly said was something they wanted to use less. One thing I didn't expect was that more than half of our participants also chose to monitor apps that they feel really good about using. So they seem to want to know, for example, how much time they were spending with their fitness app or managing their finances or reading the Bible or learning a foreign language. So potentially some kind of design opportunity there to support people in some quantified self behaviors around monitoring things they like doing with their phone. And then relative to their baseline use, we saw that people cut back on the amount of time they spent with their phone by about 33 minutes a day. More interestingly was where that reduction came from. So on the left are people's is usage data about the amount of time people spent with the apps they feel good about using. Over on the right are the apps that people said were a waste of their time. The blue is their baseline use, and then the yellow shows what happened the next week when they were using MyTime. So the amount of time people spent with the apps they felt good about using was unchanged, and people cut down on their waste of time apps by about 20%, which worked out to almost an hour a day. As I mentioned, we had this aspiration setting feature where we asked people each day what they wanted to do. This was totally optional. People chose to set 57 different aspirations across the week that they were using MyTime. Some of these were really topical, like less Instagram usage, so something very directly related to the study. Some of these were not related at all, like make cashew cheese. I guess that's what we do in Seattle. I don't know. And then when these time's up dialogues showed up, if the user had set an aspiration, we reflected it back to them. And we did see that people were significantly more likely to exit the app they were using if they saw one of their own self-defined aspirations. Okay, so it was exciting to see that this seemed to be effective for inducing this short-term change. And specifically that people were able to cut back in some areas of their use without cutting down on phone use in general, so preserving others. And that this kind of differentiated non-use aligned with the behaviors that people said they wanted to engage in. So that's good. But as anyone who's ever gone on a diet or tried to quit smoking or designed any persuasive technology can tell you, long-term behavior change is really hard. And so certainly understanding what happens next is an important next step for this project. And so exploring whether this is kind of a first step where you transition people to other types of supports, whether this is just simply something that doesn't work in the long run, whether this is a crutch that people can use indefinitely, whether this can train behaviors but doesn't support people in making changes without the tool. Those are all kinds of things we'll be exploring in the future. Second, this doesn't really address this problem that came out of the first study I talked about around context constraints and activity constraints. So something that we're looking at now is how we can support people in setting kind of context-specific goals. So using lightweight sensing to help people set goals, not just around what apps they use or for how long, but also in what context they use them. So like if you're listening to a really great talk and you don't want to be using your phone, maybe we can help you with that. I'm just joking. And then the thing probably that I'm most excited about moving forward is looking beyond these kinds of outside standalone supports and looking at the redesign of the experiences themselves. Because across several studies in this space, I have definitely gotten the sense that people don't really want these third-party tools to police their usage, at least not as kind of a broad solution to this problem. So what I am focused on right now is exploring how we can redesign the experiences themselves so that as people are engaging with them, it's easy for them to set the boundaries that they feel good about and engage the way they want to. Yes?
So I'm curious if part of the problem is the economic model, right? If the economic model of a lot of these app makers is advertising and engagement makes them more money, it seems like they're always going to want to make these things that cause you to do that. And so I'm curious whether, is there a way of me saying, yes, I want to change this behavior and I'll put $200 a year or $500 a year to it, and then that money actually getting paid to the app developers who make apps that don't take your attention so that they can make money rather than relying on advertising. I just feel like the money is what's
Yeah, then only poor people would have this problem. Rich people wouldn't be distracted anymore.
Yeah, well, it may be a different price for different people.
Yeah, I like that. You can subsidize.
Right.
Okay. I think that's really exciting.
Help people, right?
For sure. So I'll talk about this a little more at the end, but it was a lot harder giving talks on this topic a year ago because it just all sort of comes back to that problem. Like the incentive structure is just driving us right toward this challenge. But it has been very exciting over the last couple of months to see some companies right around here starting to do some soul searching and rethinking their attention economy models. So like I said, I'll talk about this a little more at the end, but there are a few reasons why I'm optimistic that maybe we can do something different. Okay, so looking at redesigning the experiences themselves, which is sort of the basis of this third project that I want to talk about, which has similar goals, but is also targeting children rather than adults. So this was before the Coco movie came out. I feel like now Pixar is gonna yell at me, maybe, I don't know. But we created an app that we called Coco's Videos, and the intention is to explore how we can support these same types of behaviors in preschoolers. And so specifically, we were asking, can the technologies that preschoolers are engaging with support them in learning to self-regulate their use? So can kids kind of learn these skills early on that we think are so important to daily life as they grow? There are a lot of technologies out there that are already designed to restrict children's use of technology. They are broadly known as parental controls. They don't teach self-regulation. They instead force children to comply with limits by locking them out of different experiences. So they are designed to regulate, not to support self-regulation. The use of parental controls doesn't actually predict children's self-regulation later, so there isn't any evidence that it supports kids in developing useful skills. And in fact, self-determination theory suggests that imposing these kind of rigid and controlling structures on kids would undermine their intrinsic motivation to self-regulate. Now, in contrast to parental controls, you may have seen what's known as autoplay or post-play if you've ever watched any videos online. These aren't explicitly described as mechanisms for increasing use, but they're kind of consistent with that sort of behavior. So they're a common feature of internet video on demand platforms where when you finish one video, the next one starts playing automatically. You can see this on Hulu or Netflix or YouTube or even YouTube Kids. So it shows up a lot. No one has looked at how exposure to autoplay or postplay influences self-regulation, but prior findings have said that parents find it kind of frustrating and think it's not great for their kids. So with some of that background, we set out to explore how we could design a video player for kids that would help them in self-regulating their use and actually taking that step themselves of turning it off at the end. To do so, we first started with existing evidence-based curricula for preschool that teach self-regulation in other contexts, so nothing to do with technology. The first curriculum that we looked at is called Tools of the Mind. And one of the core mechanics here is that it teaches self-regulation through what's known as a play plan. So it's super cute. It has these 4-year-olds planning out how they're going to play and drawing pictures of what their play is going to be like and making these kind of goal-directed choices ahead of time. So here's a play plan by Amari. We also looked at the high scope curriculum, which has about 60 years of really high quality evidence behind it and has been very successful in improving kids' self-regulation in ways that persist throughout their lifetime. And this similarly is built on what's called a plan, do, review cycle. So lots of elements here that are similar to the way we design persuasive technologies for adults and goal setting theory and things like that. Plan, do, review has children kind of plan out in advance what they're going to do, gives them information as they do it about their behavior relative to their plan, and then gives them the opportunity to reflect on what they did at the end. So we took some of those core mechanics and we created a bunch of storyboards. We did interviews and diary studies with 55 different families of preschoolers where we had them look at some of our design ideas, tell us about daily life, keep track of their transitions at home. I spent a lot of time reading diary entries about kids' tantrums. We did some co-design work with preschoolers where we had them come in and help us figure out what this video player should look like. And then we did a lab session of one of our early prototypes with 14 families where they came into the lab and the preschoolers tried out some of these different features so we could see how usable they were for this sometimes challenging age group. The result of all of this was Coco's videos. So the app lets kids plan out the set of videos that they're going to watch. So it starts by asking them how much time this experience should take. It then asks them to pick a planned next activity. So what are they going to do when this experience ends? And then they have a few different mechanisms for constructing this little playlist where they can pick from videos that they've selected in the past. They can search for anything they want on YouTube. And they can select from our recommendations library to construct this planned ordered list. And you can see it kind of accumulate over on the left. So that's their plan. When they press play, the videos play sequentially as they've planned. And then at the start of the last video, and again 1 minute before the full experience ends, they see these little warnings telling them that this transition is approaching. It pauses the video, and they actually have to tap it to make it go away. So they have to really notice. And then at the end, that activity that they had selected as their next activity is reflected back to them. This Coco character says to them, now it's time to read. Are you ready to read? Or whatever it is that they had selected. So we created 3 different versions of this transition screen at the end. This is our neutral version, where the only interactive piece is that home button, which lets you go back to the beginning and select more videos to watch. We created this alternative version where everything is the same. Coco comes on and says, it's time to read. Are you ready to read? The home button is there. The child can go back to the beginning at any time. But there's also this little video player in the corner that autoplays some more content related to the last video they just watched. I know, evil technologies. We created a 3rd version of the transition screen. Again, everything is the same as the neutral version, except that there is no home button. So you cannot go back, you cannot play more videos, you're just locked into this experience, and it's a brick. So these are our neutral, post-play, and controlled variants of the experience. And everything else about the experience, the planning and so forth, is the same. We ran a deployment study. We recruited 24 families with at least 1 preschooler between the ages of 3 and 5. And we asked them to participate in this 3-week in-home deployment. So we gave them a tablet with our app installed, and it automatically switched between these 3 different versions, the controlled, neutral, and post-play versions of our app for 1 week each, and the order was counterbalanced across participants. At the end, we had parents complete an exit survey where they told us a little bit about their experience. And then during the deployment, we collected 2 different types of data. So first we logged what kids were doing, what they were watching, for how long and when. And then we also collected audio data from the device's microphone. So 1 minute before the transition until 2 minutes after the transition point, we recorded the ambient audio to give us this really rich qualitative sample of what was happening when that kid had to turn off the device, or didn't have to turn off the device, when the experience ended. So I'll just talk about a few of the themes that came out of this. I haven't even published this yet, so you're the first people to hear about this. So excited. First, we saw that kids really liked talking to Coco. So Coco asked this question at the end based on their next activity, like, now it's time to eat, are you ready to eat? And kids really wanted to reply. They talked back a lot. And they said, I am hungry. Or Coco asks, are you ready to eat? And the child says, yeah, I'm going to get a snack. Coco says, it's time to play outside. Are you ready to play outside? And the child says, I'm ready to play outside. Or, of course. Or sometimes, nope, 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 no. So lots of dialogue with Coco. Even though Coco was not interactive and did not respond, kids continued to answer its questions. We saw that our preschoolers displayed a fair amount of autonomy and ownership over this transition. So they weren't looking to a parent or asking if it was okay. They were sort of the owner of what happened next. So Coco says, it's time to eat. Are you ready to eat? Kid said, it's time to eat, and I'm eating. Or Coco says, are you ready to eat? And the child says, and mom says, what will you do next? Clean the living room? And the child, oh, that's not supposed to say it's time to eat. Coco says, it's time to play outside. Are you ready to play outside? Mom says, what will you do next? Clean the living room? And the child says, no, I picked play outside, obviously. Coco says, are you ready to play outside? And the child says, I'm ready to go outside. I clicked going outside after my videos. I really like this one, super cute. Coco says, it's time to do something else. Are you ready to do something else? The child says, nah, I'm not going to watch anymore. I'm going to do something else. And mom says, okay, what are you going to do? The child says, now I'm going to dance. Put on music. It was super cute. They did, and they all started dancing. It's great. So this autonomy that we saw was interesting because it kind of showed this goal-directed, intentional behavior. And that matters because engaging in purposeful, goal-directed behaviors is the mediating factor between having opportunities to plan and seeing gains in self-regulation. So we were super excited to see this show up. We also saw these preschoolers engage in what's known as other regulation, so kind of regulating the people around them. So Coco says, it's time to read. Are you ready to read? And the kid says, Dad, it's time to read. See what the tablet said? Or Coco says, it's time for bed. And the child announces, everybody, it's time for bed. Coco says, it's time to eat. Are you ready to eat? And the child then turns to his brother and says, it's time to eat. Are you ready to eat? Coco says, it's time to go somewhere. Are you ready to go? Child tells his parents, like, we have to go now, first to mom and then to dad. And so this other regulation was interesting because this is kind of a known developmental step in the process of internalizing norms and adopting them for yourself. So this is an important piece of becoming self-regulated. One last theme that I wanted to mention was kids' tendency to sort of ritualize these transitions, come to expect them, and make it a part of their routine. So Coco says, it's time for bed. Are you ready to sleep? And the child says, I want to hear her say it's time for bed right before that transition shows up. In other instances, we saw kids quoting the Coco transition audio before it actually played. So kind of anticipating it and doing it for Coco so they know what's coming up. There's one really cute one where this little girl hears Coco say, "It's time to eat. Are you ready to eat?" And then she says to her mom, "Mom, it's time to eat." And mom tells her, like, "Well, we can't actually eat yet. We have to wait for the rest of the family to come home." And the little girl says that that's okay, but that she wants to hear Coco say it's time to eat again when it's actually time to start. So all of these little suggestions that this kind of parasocial relationship and little back and forth with Coco started to become somewhat meaningful for kids and became a routine that they expected. We looked at the differences across these 3 different versions of the app that I mentioned, and a few things showed up. First, we looked at how often parents had to intervene, so actually come in and take the tablet away or turn it off for the child. And there were no significant differences between our neutral and controlled version, although that might change over a longer time or with a larger sample. But parents were far less likely to intervene when post-play was up. So a lot more fighting and a lot more kind of not so harmonious engagement around the tablet. We also looked at the frequency of what we called collaborative revision. So these were instances where the child did go back and watch more videos, but that was sort of a collaborative change of plans that the parent and child agreed on together. So the child says, like, "Oh, it's done," and dad says, "Well, I'm not quite done making dinner. If you want to watch a few more videos, you can." And the kid says, "Okay, how long can I do that for?" And then goes back to the beginning and starts again. So this kind of like flexible, real-time change of plans. We saw that this happened pretty often, actually, between 10 and 15% of the time when that was an option, and it almost never happened when they were locked into the experience at the end. So we kind of precluded this collaborative revision that seemed to be something families would engage in when they had the option. When these post-play videos were displayed, kids were less likely to respond to Coco's question. They were less likely to make statements of autonomy, and they spent significantly longer with the tablet than in either of the other 2 conditions. And we didn't see any differences between the neutral or controlled version along any of these dimensions. As I mentioned, we did this survey at the end where we asked parents what they liked. We asked them if they liked having this lockout mechanism at the end, and they mostly did, but were a little bit mixed. So about a third of the time, parents said they would prefer not to have that lockout mechanism at all. And kind of on both sides, whether they liked it or didn't, they sort of expressed some appreciation for the other side as well. So parents were sort of saying, well, it makes things less flexible, but it makes it a little easier to transition, and kind of appreciating both sides of that. This post-play was not very popular. So about a third of parents said that they didn't really mind it. It's okay if it's there. But no one actually said that this was a feature they wanted, despite the fact that it's in pretty much every video platform out there. So a few of the findings that came out of this. First, just seeing kids embracing the planning experience and then owning this transition, so a lot of autonomy throughout. This suggestion that the transition experience itself and the kind of UI around that became meaningful for them. The fact that post-play was associated with increased friction between parents and kids. And the fact that this control at the end, this lockout mechanism, didn't make much of a difference in too many of the dimensions that we looked at. So it didn't really cut down on the amount of time kids spent with these extra videos. It didn't make a difference in terms of parent-child friction, but it did get in the way of this collaborative revision. So kind of zooming out a little bit, a few things that have come out of these and other studies I've done in this space. First, this theme of never or no being easier than sometimes. So if you really don't want to engage in problematic behaviors with a particular technology, stop using it altogether. That seems to be the only thing that works well for people. Multiple participants across these and other studies have used the words Pandora's box when talking about some of this. So parents will say, like, just think about whether you even want to give your kid access, because once you start, it's really hard to stop. Or adults speaking about their own behaviors and describing all of these kinds of patterns of engagement that come along with their use that they don't feel great about. And so I think this presents this kind of design opportunity to rethink some of the contracts that we're making with our users and the ways in which they seem to be a little bit coercive. So we're giving people things that they value and want to use, but it's not totally on their own terms. So I run the User Empowerment Lab at the University of Washington, and our kind of overarching mission is to redesign our everyday technologies so that we are giving users the value that they want without coercing them into accepting side effects that they don't really want. So hopefully it's clear how that shows up in this project. I'm just going to really briefly mention 4 projects that we've started recently that fall under this umbrella. First, we know that on Android devices, apps are way over-permissioned. So users make decisions about security permissions at install time, and there isn't really any granularity after that. So it was super easy for me to have Coco's videos just listen in on people's conversations and then upload that to the cloud and then listen to it. And of course, there's lots of IRB oversight, and I had lots of conversations with my participants about that, but every app that you're using might not be so thoughtful. So what can we do that allows users to give apps the power that they need when it offers value to the user without kind of opening this Pandora's box of potential exploitation? So how can you allow an app to support voice search without letting it listen to everything you do at all times? One project that we're working on now considers the fact that victims of intimate partner violence have systematic ways in which they will leverage social media and mobile devices to escape abusive situations. But other work has shown that those exact same technologies are things that abusers use to track, stalk, harass their victims and separate them from other social relations. So how can we support this vulnerable population in getting access to all of those tools that can help and empower them without also exposing them to this added risk? Another project we're working on is about understanding the biases that occur, or the way that our interactions with voice interfaces shape our biases. And so as this technology becomes kind of mainstream, what are the potentially unanticipated side effects that come along with that? And what should we do about it as designers? And then finally, we're working on this project to look at civil discourse in online spaces. So is it possible to be part of Reddit, but without having to accept all the trolls that go along with it? So 4 different things that I'm excited about that all seem a little bit daunting. But when all of the undergrads here apply to my PhD program, we will be able to solve all of these big challenges. So I just want to give a shout out to my awesome students who've helped in so many ways with so much of this, and also to all of the people who have helped with these user engagement projects. It totally takes a village to give a Stanford talk, so grateful to all of them and to all of you for being here. Thanks so much.
We have time for some discussion and questions.
So when you were talking about these rating categories, when you're rating the effectiveness of different options, do you consider the motivations behind the behavior, like addiction versus habit out of boredom versus?
Do you mean in the survey at the beginning where we were asking people what they wanted to try?
Yeah, or just when you're even considering long-term changes for the product or project, how much do you consider why people are checking their phone every 6 minutes?
Right. Yeah, I think that matters a lot. I would say we looked at that a little, but not as deeply as might be useful. So for example, we asked all of our deployment participants, name, if you could change one thing about the way you use your phone, describe what that would be, so that we had some context around what they were interested in doing. And then we looked at different features of those interests. So for example, we saw that some people were very reduction focused, we called it, where they really wanted to cut back on something. Other people were very context focused, where they didn't necessarily want to use their phone less, but they wanted to make these more targeted context specific changes. We saw people who wanted to keep using their phone, but kind of displace certain behaviors with others. So I want to make more voice calls relative and fewer texts, that kind of thing. We didn't look we didn't have people describe whether they felt like they were addicted. There's some work that has shown that people generally experience this more as annoyance than addiction. So understanding that, I think, would be really useful. So yeah, a little bit, and I think it's super important. Yeah.
What's been your biggest frustration working on these projects?
Co-designing with 2-year-olds. It's horrible. No, I'm joking. It's a good question. So I think one thing that's frustrating is the point that James made before of just the incentive structure and the kind of larger system around all of this that sometimes just feels oppressive. It's like, what if I figure out exactly what's going on here? Like, then what? Like, so what? It doesn't matter because so many people make so much money off of this. So that feels like an uphill battle some days, although as I was saying, I think less so. I think behavior change type projects are hard in general. And there have definitely been moments of like, okay, I want to teach kids self-regulation. And then I just feel like that's just an impossible task. So a lot of these have felt like I don't even know where to start. One thing that I've done a lot to try to get around that is to look at what has happened in other domains that's been successful and try to build from there. Because if all I have to do is translate somebody else's work into an app, that is much easier than if I have to figure out everything from scratch. And then finally, one last thing I would mention is some resistance to design from people. So this might be more true in the US than other places, but people have this really strong kind of sense of self-reliance and desire for self-control. So I remember like presenting one interviewee with different design ideas. What do you think about this or that? And they're like, these are for weak-minded people with no self-control. And I think that's kind of a common sentiment. Like we think it's all on us, which is interesting given that people are really working hard to kind of break down our self-control and hold our attention for as long as possible. So there's an interesting tension there where I want to like respect what users want, and users think that they want their own self-control to be kind of the sum all of what happens, but meanwhile, they're kind of fighting an uphill battle. So that resistance to design just kind of like undermines my whole research agenda. So, yeah.
On a slightly more uplifting note, I'd like to dig into this economic argument a little bit because it rings a little hollow to me in the following way. Like if we take other domains in which there's an economic incentive to increase consumption, food, or as an example, or well, actually, let's just take that one. There are also there are entire companies and industries that have economic incentives about trying to help people reduce them. Think about like sort of the exercise and diet industries and others. You could argue that each individual player only has, say, the economic incentive to increase consumption or something like that. But there is a counterbalance in a way that I feel like I actually don't really see so much within the tech industry. Like I don't see an industry that people are paying money to do the equivalent of like exercise more or have more self-control or spend less time. I'm wondering if it would be possible to, yes, we should, Facebook, Google, et cetera, should definitely be considering how to improve their designs and make them less addictive in various ways. But I'm curious if there are ways to actually sort of grow that kind of counterculture incentive, in a way that we see in many other domains here.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is still true, but I saw some statistic a couple years ago about how America spends more money than any other country on healthcare and the least amount of money on food or something like that. And it seems similar where there's like this, I don't know, these two players in this arms race for your health. So I don't know. I've seen a lot of resistance to these outside tools. There are a number of commitment devices that you can buy to help you cut back on your use. I'm not sure that they're well designed enough, so maybe that's the problem. But there also seems to be some user resistance to adopting them. People want to think it's all on them, that they can do it themselves without help. I'm not sure exactly why, because that's a little different from the diet metaphor where people are perfectly willing to go have a personal trainer help them or have, a calorie counting buddy or something like that.
I wonder how much of that has to do with the cultural narrative around whose fault it is if I'm eating high calorie foods.
Yeah, that's a good point too. And I mean, that actually, to speak to the frustration question, the kind of social ideologies about tech addiction and what's good use and what's bad use and distraction and you're a Luddite if you don't use this stuff, but you're an addict if you do use this stuff. That definitely complicates all of this in terms of what users want and think they want and how we respond to that. And even as a researcher, how I think about some of these questions, like when am I just kind of imposing value judgments about tech use being bad, and when is there actually something negative for people happening, that kind of thing. Yeah.
So for your third project, the Coco videos, I was surprised by the lack of user outrage when you took away their ability to you just stop them in the middle of a video.
Oh, it doesn't. Yes,
oh,
great point. I'm sorry. Yeah. So the time limit is a cap, and you can only add videos to the playlist in whole units up to that higher bound.
So you must be filtering out those hour-long sequences of cartoons on YouTube.
Yeah, you can watch Wheels on the Bus for 300 minutes or something like that. Yeah, totally. So it would start by bringing up search results that fit in their total cap, and then as their budget shrinks, they kind of disappear or are grayed out. And that works because kids don't understand time very well.
YouTube videos is a strange Dadaist hellscape.
Yeah, that's right.
It's weird.
When people are designing apps, what are some ways that they can avoid kind of falling into design patterns that are kind of bad for users?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the first thing to do is to not explicitly try to do it on purpose. So there's a whole field around what's known as dark patterns. I don't know if that's something you've heard of, but you can look for these kind of known ways of sneaking extra stuff into people's shopping carts, like, oh, look, you should buy this travel insurance. You totally need that. I know you do. Or telling people that they can use this coupon code, but not applying it for them automatically and then making it kind of hard to find later. So there are all of these dark patterns where you can kind of intentionally decide to do things that are manipulative or addictive or keep people there longer. So the first thing I would say is don't do it on purpose. And then the second part is harder, figuring out what we can kind of proactively do. This kind of idea of contained amount of content, I think, is helpful, and having people decide for themselves the sort of serving size of what they want to consume. I think it aligns with a lot of best practices around intentionality and mindfulness and kind of respecting users' wants. So instead of having kind of an endless stream of content that they can continue to consume, having them define how much content there is helps. In this project and one other that I didn't talk about today, Coco's videos and past design project, we saw that having intentional stopping points, or kind of natural stopping points, I guess is a better way to say it, was helpful. So kids don't actually have to stop at the end. It's just kind of like a natural place to pause, to give them that moment of self-reflection. So kind of like chapters in a book or something like that. The book isn't over. You can keep going, but there's sort of this natural nudge to stop and think and say, do I really want to keep going? As opposed to just kind of being drawn in through inertia. I think that helps. I'm doing a study right now where it seems like the thing that gets people to stop is to show them the same content again. So I don't know exactly what to make of that yet. I don't think I would recommend doing that intentionally as a design feature, but I think exploring that will be interesting. So there are a couple things. Yeah.
I'm sure you're familiar with Tristan Harris, Time Well Spent, and also the Center for Humane Technology. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the way that we track things like this that we find that we're interested in tends to be on very things that we're trying to reduce our time with. So if I save them in Facebook or on Twitter or something, then I'm more likely to go back there and say, what's new happening with that?
That's interesting. So I'm sorry, you're saying like you intentionally go back to these experiences because
that's where you're tending to track the things that you're interested in following, even if it's technology use reduction.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think it would be cool to have some kind of like bookmark bucket where you can move things that you have decided intentionally that you're interested in to some kind of sandbox, and then you can go check up on that. That sounds interesting. I like that idea a lot. Yeah, I like what they're doing, and I mean, I think the Center for Humane Technology was only announced like a couple weeks ago or something. Recently, a couple investors at Apple wrote this open letter to the company. So they own about $1 billion worth of shares. And they wrote this letter saying, like, you're addicting our kids. This is so bad for them. You have to stop it. So it's an exciting time to be alive if you're a parental controls researcher. Like, this is great. And so a year ago, there was a lot less traction around some of these questions. So it's exciting to see the change in attitude. Yeah.
What was like the satisfaction for like the children on the Coco videos with like that experience versus just like the unrestricted, automatically always playing sorts of things?
Oh, that's a good question. So we asked them about how much the kids like the app in general, but we didn't survey the kids at the end, and we didn't ask them. We asked the parents which features they like. I was kind of worried that we wouldn't get like high fidelity responses if we were trying to get like feature by feature feedback from 3-year-olds. So we didn't do that. But in general, I mean, the kids loved it, but the bar is pretty low. I mean, they're preschoolers and it's videos. So yeah, we were sort of setting ourselves up for success. Yeah.
You mentioned children's lack of comprehension of time.
Oh, yeah.
And I wonder to what extent kids understand that they're self-regulating when they're setting a time limit at the beginning. They don't actually know what 20 minutes means.
Yeah, so the time limit piece, I don't think that's like a super meaningful activity for the kids in this age range. By the older end, a little bit, but that was mostly like a pragmatic constraint, and we expected that piece to be negotiated with a parent. And we really just wanted to, I think, first of all, if we were using content that were in a more standardized format, that would be easier for kids to understand. So by this age, kids can understand the idea of 2 episodes versus 3. 18 minutes is not really meaningful yet. And so I don't think that is playing an important role. I think that choosing what they're going to do next, being in charge of what the content is, and kind of seeing the holistic experience, going through that, and then stopping are the kind of pieces that contribute to self-regulation. I doubt that setting the time limit is as important.
Then if they're negotiating with a parent ahead of time how much time they have, how is that different from a parent saying at the end, you've reached your time limit, go do something else, as a child then picking a new activity?
Yeah, so I think that one thing that's really important is that this kind of scaffolds this point of self-regulation, so it leads them up to it, and then gives them the freedom to choose to self-regulate and to like take that hard step of turning it off or not. So if parent comes in and says, oh, time's up, you're done, then the kid isn't really doing the act of self-regulation in the same way. And they can, like certainly parents and kids can make that happen, but we kind of standardized it a little so that was always sort of the experience.
Great, we'll take any other questions offline. Let's thank our speaker one more time.